Hey, Joe Brunsman here, back again with a video on a common question that I see, and that is, does an MSP actually need cyber insurance? And I wanted to give everybody here a few considerations, some things I think everybody should understand and be aware of before you start looking at the cyber insurance for your MSP. Obviously, legal disclaimer down there. I'm not your insurance guy. I'm not your attorney. I'm not providing official advice. This is for general information purposes only. Let's get into it. This is actually a combination of a few videos that I've put together before, kind of refined down for an MSP. If you like this type of content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and leave a comment. Tell me what you think if I missed anything. Those videos were dealing with cyber deductibles, a run through I did specifically on an MSP insurance policy, also known as a Tech E&O policy, kind of what I think everyone should know there and some considerations, what's in a cyber policy, and service providers and data breaches, who pays the bills. All right, so before you really even start thinking about insurance, there's two things you really need to understand. There's two sides to most policies, and that's going to be third-party coverage and first-party coverage. What is the difference? Well, third parties, that could be your clients, your vendors, some other party. It's someone who wants your money is probably an easy way to think about it. What would first party be? Well, that's going to be you. That's your business, your MSP. And think about first party coverage is, that's money that you have to pay for your business, right? That you have to pay or you need to pay to keep that business operating, bring it back up to speed, et cetera. For my fellow insurance nerds out there, all like two of you who are watching maybe, second party is actually the insurance company. A little fun insurance trivia for you. All right, so let's think about what could an E&O policy cover? Because before you really want to go to a cyber policy, it makes sense that you understand what you've already potentially got inside of your insurance policy. Now, every policy is going to be different. If you have any questions, seek legal counsel, familiar with your particular circumstances. But here's an example I had in a previous policy. Now, obviously, your policy could be different. They're different across state lines, even if it's the same insurance company, the same policy. So pay attention to your own policy, but this is for information purposes. Now you'll see here you got a lot going on, but the blue, right? Remember that from the third party coverage. You have professional services, media liability, technology liability, Privacy Act violations, business associate if you're a business associate of a covered entity under HIPAA, privacy fines, if you're dealing with PCI, credit cards, et cetera. So that's, you're looking at it, you're like, hey, somebody else wants my money. That's generally what that covers right there. Now, what about first party coverage? Once again, going back, that's the red. So cost of notification, crisis costs. If you're dealing with extortions, that's generally ransomware, dealing with breach expenses, a fraud of technology, business interruption expenses. Obviously, those are things that, hey, your business needs to pay to kind of keep running and keep operating. Now, what could a cyber policy cover? Well, here's just an example that I pulled from a random cyber policy to kind of illustrate the point. Now, remember the blues, third party, the reds, first party. So here's blue. Once again, liable, right? You're liable to those third parties. Those third parties probably want your money for some reason. So that could be data and network liability, regulatory, we saw that earlier, payment card, we saw that earlier, media liability, we saw that earlier in the E&O policy example. Now, what would be the first party coverage in there? Well, you'll see breach notification loss, there's going to be credit monitoring in here, some business interruption, dependent business interruption, cyber extortion, right? We saw that again in the E&O policy, dealing probably with ransomware, data recovery costs, and of course, e-crime at the bottom. That has to do generally with social engineering, wire fraud, etc. So let's just pull it all back together real quick, and we'll look at the two side by side. And you can actually pause the video right here and kind of read between the two, and you could probably just draw mental lines. Don't draw on your screen. Draw mental lines between even things that just sound completely analogous. Now, obviously, you'd have to read the definitions in the policy, particular exclusions, to really narrow that down. But in a broad sense, you're going to see there actually is a lot of overlap between the two. Now, why is that? Well, it actually makes a lot of sense because cyber insurance really kind of grew out of the Tech E&O policies anyway. So you can think of like a cyber policy in many regards is really just like a fancy, refined Tech E&O policy for companies that aren't necessarily, say, an MSP or a SaaS provider. However, it's not as simple as saying, hey, Joe, I'm a trust fund kid and I'm independently wealthy. So why don't I just give you all of my money and then some, and I'll buy both policies and have more insurance, and then all will be right with the world. It doesn't quite work that way, unfortunately, because you have these things called other insurance clauses inside of really, every professional line's insurance. So that's going to be both in an E&O policy and it's going to be in a cyber policy. Why do they have these? Well, the original purpose was, think about it like this. If you have a house and you have homeowners insurance, well, let's say you decided to go out and buy 3 homeowners policies to cover the same house, and then your house burns down. Would it make sense that you would then get an insurance money 3 times the value of the house that you actually insured for? It wouldn't make sense. So in the insurance industry, we call that a moral hazard, because the insurance industry doesn't want to incentivize losses where you could make money off of something being lost as opposed to just recouping the loss and then moving forward. Now, let's look kind of the tie-in here with cyber insurance. This right here, this first clause, is actually from a professional liability, aka E&O policy, and it says the following: any payment due under this policy is specifically excess of and will not contribute with any other valid and collectible insurance unless such other insurance is specifically written as excess insurance over the limit of liability of this policy. So what does that really mean? So what they're really trying to get at here is they're saying, hey, if you have 2 policies and they both cover the same thing, our policy is going to be the excess. So you have to burn through that other policy first before we could potentially respond to that. Now, that could be in, say, your E&O policy. Well, what would be in a cyber policy? Here's an example. This policy will only apply as excess over any other valid and collectible insurance, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Essentially the same thing that previous other insurance clause said. So what do we have now? You could have an E&O policy and you could have a cyber policy. And there could be an overlap in coverage between the two. And each insurer is essentially saying, hey, it's the other guy's problem to pay for these losses. It's not us, it's them. So that could really kind of leave you in a bind, because if you take that to its insane conclusion, essentially you would have insurance, but you'd be stuck in this endless loop of each insurance company just auto emailing each other back saying, it's not me, it's you. Now, obviously that doesn't make sense. There is a way that that's resolved. And obviously this depends on the state and the jurisdiction you're in and the fact patterns of the case, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But generally the idea is something called a mutually repugnant other insurance clause. So courts have wrestled with this in the past, and unfortunately there's really no good resolution. No matter what happens, no matter how the courts and the jurisdictions lay this out, somebody's going to be pissed. And it's either going to be you, it's going to be the insurance company, or it's going to be both of you. Generally, I'd say looking at the case law, it's probably going to be you. So how does this play out? Well, as we talked about before, you could have coverage in multiple areas or across multiple policies. So if you have an E&O policy and you have a cyber insurance policy, obviously there's going to be overlap there. Sometimes you just can't get around this. There may be specific circumstances, like very specific needs your MSP would have that you're trying to insure against, that would say, hey, yes, we do need a cyber policy. And we're going to get into that. But how do they actually level all of this out? Well, generally it's, once again, caveat, depends on the state, your jurisdiction, seek legal counsel. But generally what kind of happens is you may actually end up paying both deductibles. Now, that seems insane, but it's not as crazy as you think, because there's really no good answer here. Generally what happens is you're going to have overlapping coverage, and to avoid having this endless loop of the insurance companies pointing to the other guy, they're going to prorate the loss between themselves. If there's some conflict, generally the state insurance commissioner gets involved, but you may end up paying part or all of both deductibles. So that could really screw you because, generally you're thinking of, your E&O policy is, hey, the probability of someone suing me is probably fairly low. The probability of multiple people suing me in a year also probably fairly low, all things considered. The probability of using a cyber policy, on the other hand, that could be much higher. Maybe you could use it multiple times in a year. Knock on wood, you don't have to do that. But you should be prepared if you're going to have both a cyber policy and an E&O policy that you may actually fall into this trap. So you need to kind of plan ahead for that, work with the right insurance guy, speak to legal counsel, see how that would actually play out for you. But not all is lost. Cyber insurance nerds like me and cyber law nerds like me, we have been really kind of hyper focused on this weird little niche of the law for quite some time. So in certain circumstances, you could get something called an amendatory endorsement. And what does that say? This goes right back to that other insurance clause. It helps modify that. And the top part kind of says the same thing that we heard before. The insurance under this policy shall apply in excess of any other valid and collectible insurance, blah, 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 blah. Except that, caveat, provided that this policy shall be primary solely with respect to breach response services, cyber extortion loss, and data recovery costs covered under the breach response and first party loss insuring agreement. So what are they saying here? Hey, if this company has a data breach and maybe this is covered under some other policy, well, this policy, the cyber policy, is going to be the primary response to that. So that's the insurance company essentially saying, hey, we got the ball on this one. We're going to take charge of it. And it kind of makes sense too, because if you're a cyber insurer, you probably don't want some professional liability insurance company who has very limited to no experience dealing with a data breach trying to run part or all of the show when it comes to dealing with these services, because they may kind of screw something up. They may unnecessarily inflate costs. It makes sense. In this case, it works out for you if you have something like this as the policyholder, because then at least you know this particular part, hey, the cyber is going to be primary. Then it goes on to say at the bottom there, an additional clause, the existence of other insurance available to an insured shall not affect the underwriter's obligations toward an insured in paying loss covered under this policy, nor shall it delay payment of such loss. So there you see kind of an extra little cushion providing another assurance to the insured. In this case, it could potentially be your business that's holding the cyber policy. So what does a cyber policy have that an E&O policy doesn't have, generally speaking? What are those things that, maybe they're just so juicy or just so necessary for your business that you're like, you know what, I do actually need to have a cyber policy. Obviously, it's going to depend on the cyber policy. Every cyber policy is different, but it could be some of these things. If you're worried about bricking, cryptojacking, some sort of affirmative regulatory coverage, such as CCPA, GDPR, LMNOP, whatever's coming out next. If you're worried about social engineering, wire fraud, cybercrime, funds transfer fraud, some sort of maybe an internal misappropriations by your staff. Utility fraud also kind of falls under the cryptojacking umbrella. Voluntary shutdown coverage, so that has to deal with business interruption reimbursement. Dependent business interruption, dependent system failure. Why would you care about those last two? Well, let's say you have something on Azure or AWS, and you're worried that, hey, if those guys go down, maybe my E&O policy doesn't respond to that, so then I'd have to get a cyber policy to cover for that particular risk. Other things, business system failure. What's a business system failure? So that's not because of a breach, but it's something happened. There's some, say, like a misconfiguration somewhere. Your system goes hard down. You're not able to generate revenue because your system is down, once again, not because of a breach. Then potentially the policy could jump into play there. Reputational harm, that's another kind of good one. Reputational harm would be Following a breach, you have clients just leave the business. We've seen that before with various MSPs where malicious third party came in through their RMM or RMS, ransomwared all their clients. Clients end up jumping ship. Obviously, the MSP, the owners there, they don't want to just start from scratch and start growing things all over again. So reputational harm could be very useful for you. And then, of course, employee extortion, rogues employees. That would be if, say, a former employee is threatening to somehow extort your business, generally with ransomware. Maybe they say that they've got some payload hidden in a dark corner somewhere, and if you don't pay them money because you fired them, then they're just going to shut your system down. They're going to lock it down. You're never going to get it back. So those kind of could be some examples of just specific cyber coverages that maybe you can't get in an E&O policy that for your particular circumstance are just so juicy, you just feel this like deep desire to buy a cyber policy. That may be one of the reasons there. So the ultimate answer on, does an MSP actually need a cyber insurance policy? Well, it depends. Remember at the beginning of this presentation, I said, here's a few considerations for you, not the definitive answer. It's just going to depend on your MSP and kind of what you're looking for. You may want those higher limits, or you may need those specific sublimits. There could be some specific coverage feature that you're looking for. There could be other reasons that I haven't covered, something that, at midnight here, I just haven't quite thought of. So, don't discount the idea of having a cyber policy. It does have its purpose for an MSP. But those purposes, I would argue, are generally very limited and very specific to that MSP on if you should actually purchase something like that or not. Now, different question here. Should you require your clients to have cyber insurance? I would argue the answer is a huge yes on that. Big, big yes. I'll probably make a different video on that. So, like, share, comment, subscribe, blah, 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 blah. But I think that's coming up here in the future to really explain that on why I think you all should be requiring your clients to carry cyber insurance. All right, with that, that's the end of this video. If you like this information, this is where you can go to actually download my latest 500-page book for free. That's the PDF. If you prefer a Kindle version or you want to get a physical paperback, you can find that on Amazon. With that, that is the end of this presentation. I hope you guys thoroughly enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please leave them below. I'll do my best to respond to those questions if I can. Time permitting, depends on if my wife lets me get away for a little more free time. With that, I hope you guys stay safe. Have a good day.